In the fading light of the 19th century, an atlas looked as if someone had spilled a single color across it, vast swaths of pink. That pink signified the British Empire, the most extensive dominion human beings had ever assembled, a polity so immense that old sayings claimed the sun never set on its possessions. From the crowded docks of Hong Kong to the diamond fields of South Africa, from the frozen reaches of northern Canada to the wool-covered plains of Australia, the era bowed to Queen Victoria's authority. Britain's strength rested on its fleet. The Royal Navy ruled the seas with a supremacy that had gone largely unchallenged since the age of Nelson. London was more than the capital city, it was the throbbing financial heart of the globe, the central clearinghouse of world commerce, and for much of the civilized world, an informal arbiter of international disputes. To the British governing elite, the Victorian aristocrats who directed this global enterprise from the leather-bound privacy of their club rooms on Pall Mall, the world appeared orderly, rank-structured, and naturally British. Across the Atlantic, a different power was gathering force. The United States of America, long regarded by European elites with a mixture of condescension and wary interest, had transformed in ways that made the old evaluations obsolete. For decades, the Americans had seemed provincial, uncouth, loud, and preoccupied with continental expansion. They had endured a devastating internal war and had prosecuted a series of brutal campaigns against indigenous peoples to consolidate control over the continent. By the mid-1890s, however, America's westward frontier was closed. The domestic project of conquest had reached its limits, and the restless energy that once propelled settlers and pioneers inward began to look outward. Beneath the surface, the United States had quietly reinvented itself. While Britain continued to police its imperial network, America had been building the industrial infrastructure of a global power. American steel production had overtaken Britain's. The railroad system crisscrossing the United States far outstripped any other nation's line mileage. Cities swelled with waves of immigrants drawn to labor opportunities. Factories hummed with productive might. It was a colossus waking from dormancy, a reservoir of industrial potential that lacked an external outlet. The American economy's boom and bust rhythms were notorious, and the Depression of 1893 had left the nation politically and socially agitated, hungry for distraction and for symbols of national assertiveness. A rising tide of jingoism convinced many Americans that their country had matured and deserved a prominent place among the great powers. Two tectonic forces were moving toward collision. On one side, an overstretched British Empire whose global reach was becoming increasingly costly to maintain. On the other, an ascendant, impatient American republic eager to assert itself.
Their clash would not come at a choke point like Suez or Gibraltar, nor at a major colonial capital, but rather in a hot, mosquito-choked strip of jungle on South America's edge, territory that most contemporary maps left vaguely blank. The quarrel between Venezuela and Great Britain was the kind of petty imperial dispute diplomats had long learned to file away and forget. Its origins reached back to the Napoleonic era, when the Dutch ceded the colony that became British Guiana to Britain. The Dutch had never clearly defined the colony's western frontier. Nobody had cared much about the dense, trackless rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a landscape of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and, on the surface, economically useless. Empires, however, have an aversion to leaving spaces undefined. In 1841, the British sent a German naturalist and surveyor, Robert Schomburgk, to chart the area. Schomburgk's line, later known simply as the Schomburgk Line, pushed British claims far westward, asserting control over the mouth of the Orinoco River, which was effectively Venezuela's trade lifeline. Venezuelan authorities protested, pointing to old Spanish charts that placed their eastern boundary well beyond the Essequibo River. Britain paid scant heed. Venezuela was politically fragile, repeatedly shaken by rebellions and governmental upheavals, while Britain, by contrast, believed itself unrivaled. For half a century, the disagreement simmered as a low-grade grievance. Then, in the late 1800s, fortune turned the jungle into treasure. Prospectors discovered vast alluvial gold deposits in the Ururi River Basin, smack in the heart of the contested zone. Suddenly, a landscape long ignored became extraordinarily valuable. Prospectors pulled from the mud a nugget of legendary size, reportedly over 500 ounces, and a gold rush followed. British miners and settlers streamed into the area. The British government, sensing both profit and a strategic prize, began to formalize and expand its claims, asserting jurisdiction over the Schomburg Line and then pushing further to claim an additional 33,000 square miles. For Venezuela, this was not merely an abstract territorial quarrel, but an existential crisis. Control of the Orinoco Delta would effectively give Britain leverage over Venezuela's economy. Caracas severed diplomatic ties with London in 1887 and appealed to Europe for support, with little success, for no major power wished to offend Britain. Faced with isolation, Venezuela turned to its last realistic hope: enlist the United States. Caracas hired William Lindsay Scruggs, a former U.S. diplomat, to lobby on its behalf in Washington. Scruggs was a skilled propagandist. He produced a trenchant pamphlet, British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on trial, and distributed it widely among members of Congress, influential senators, and newspaper editors. His message was simple and incendiary. Britain's actions violated the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 U.S. proclamation that the Americas should be free from future European colonization or intervention. For decades, that doctrine had been largely aspirational, rhetorical muscle laid down by presidents, but rarely backed by force, because the United States lacked a navy able to stand up to Britain's.
Scruggs' pamphlet arrived in Washington at an opportune moment. The U.S. presidency at that time was held by Grover Cleveland, a Democrat noted for personal rectitude and political conservatism, but also for being politically beleaguered. The economic distress of the period, labor unrest, and electoral pressures left Cleveland vulnerable to charges that he was weak on foreign affairs. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was a pugnacious former Boston corporate lawyer with an unshakable belief in American exceptionalism. Olney read the map and the politics and did not see a parochial border dispute so much as a test of continental supremacy. If Britain could redraw South American maps whenever gold was discovered, Olney argued, then the Monroe Doctrine was a dead letter. It would mean the United States lacked any practical control over developments in its own hemisphere. In the summer of 1895, Olney composed a diplomatic memorandum to London, a document that would quickly be remembered as one of the most forceful statements of American diplomatic assertion. The note read less like a polite request than a legal brief for American hegemony. Olney didn't merely ask for arbitration, he tutored Britain in international order. He wrote, in a sentence that stunned contemporary readers, that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition. Those words, its fiat is law, were a dramatic, almost imperial claim. Olney was telling the British, in the Western Hemisphere, Washington's pronouncements carry the weight of law. The dispatch arrived on the desk of Prime Minister Lord Salisbury in July 1895. Salisbury, a towering figure of the old conservative establishment, combined aristocratic hauteur with a diplomatic mind seasoned by decades in office. He regarded the United States as an exuberant, somewhat vulgar upstart, and greeted Olney's assertions with a mixture of irritation and amusement. Salisbury dismissed the Monroe Doctrine as a unilateral American proclamation with no status in European jurisprudence. He chose to ignore the aggressive legalism of Olney's note. How he chose to ignore it proved decisive. Salisbury let the message lie on his desk and turned to other imperial concerns: crises in Africa and the Near East, the routine cares of governing a global empire. He assumed the Americans' bluster was domestically directed and would soon pass. Washington, however, saw delay as insult. 4 months elapsed in stony silence from London. For Cleveland and Olney, the lack of response read as deliberate contempt from an imperial power that looked down on the American Republic. When a reply finally came in late November, it consisted of 2 sharply worded notes. Salisbury dismantled Olney's arguments with polite condescension. He insisted that the Monroe Doctrine did not govern a territorial dispute between a European colony and an American republic. It had no footing in accepted international law. He refused to submit the matter to arbitration and stood firm on the Schomburg demarcation. The message was formal, measured, but absolute. Mind your own business.
Cleveland took the rebuff as a personal slap. The British stance, he believed, had treated the United States like an infant in need of correction. He resolved to escalate, to pull the contest from diplomatic backrooms into the fierce light of public opinion. On December 17, 1895, he addressed Congress in a special message that detonated in Washington. He asked lawmakers to allocate funds for an American commission to investigate the border issue, a neutral-sounding charge. But he added a clause that changed everything. Once that commission determined where the rightful boundary lay, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any British act of appropriation or exercise of government in lands found to rightfully belong to Venezuela. In plain terms, if Britain refused to accept the U.S. determined line, war could follow. The speech produced an instantaneous, combustible reaction. Congress erupted. Partisan divisions that had consumed Washington over domestic policy evaporated. Republicans and Democrats, old Civil War enmities included, joined in a sudden surge of patriotic unity. The press ran feverish headlines, "War with England?" and crowds on city streets sang martial songs. Men who remembered British sympathy for the Confederacy felt an old vendetta rekindled. Irish Americans, a significant political bloc, gleefully anticipated the chance to strike at Britain. Militias polished their uniforms and drilled in anticipation. A national wartime mania seized the country, fed by industrial might, pent-up pride, and a desire to show the world that America was no second-rate power. Across the Atlantic, British newspapers on December 18th printed the news with bafflement. Many Britons had barely noticed the Venezuela quarrel before. It seemed an obscure boundary row deep in a jungle few could place on a map. Now they awoke to find the U.S. president threatening to invade Canada and sink the Royal Navy. Initially, incredulity reigned. The British assumed the American outburst might be a temporary domestic performance. But dispatches from the embassy in Washington made the seriousness of the American posture undeniable. Lord Salisbury convened his cabinet and realized the stakes were unexpectedly grave. The Admiralty ran calculations, and the results were sobering. Britain's navy, though the largest on the seas, was dispersed globally, safeguarding trade lanes from Suez to Singapore. A concentrated Atlantic deployment to fight the United States would leave imperial holdings in Asia and the Mediterranean vulnerable. Furthermore, the British Army was tiny relative to America's potential manpower. Canada, bordering the United States for thousands of miles, would be essentially undefensible if Washington chose to push across the frontier. In a war, American troops could likely seize Montreal and Toronto within weeks. Britain had no guaranteed response. Beyond manpower, the United States' industrial surge posed a different kind of peril. American shipyards were capable of producing ironclads and destroyers at speed. A protracted war with the United States would not be a limited colonial affair, but a grinding contest with a resource-rich, continent-sized foe. Still more immediately frightening to British finance was the reaction of global markets. On what came to be called Black Friday, London's stock market plunged.
British investors, heavily invested in American railroad bonds and securities, scrambled to sell. Liquidity evaporated. The City of London telegraphed the government a stark warning. A war with its largest trading partner would bankrupt British interests. Salisbury found himself boxed in. The German Kaiser had been increasingly assertive. The Boers in South Africa were growing restive and arming themselves, and in the Far East, the balance of power was shifting with Russia's ambitions and Japan's rise. Britain had pride in its policy of splendid isolation, but that posture now looked perilous. To fight the United States would mean potentially fighting alone. Salisbury, who had casually dismissed the Monroe Doctrine months earlier, was now confronting the most difficult choice of his political career: stand and risk a catastrophic war over a mosquito-swathed stretch of jungle, or yield and recalibrate British priorities. As 1895 gave way to 1896, public talk centered on fleets and invasion plans. Telegraph cables between London and Washington crackled with urgent code. For the first time in a century, the balance between the old maritime colossus and the booming republic was genuinely uncertain. Both sides flexed, both awaited the other's move. History, however, often pivots on coincidence. Just as the Venezuela crisis neared rupture, another unrelated event thousands of miles away shifted British attention and allowed an escape route from disaster. News arrived in London on January 2, 1896, of a debacle in South Africa. Leander Starr Jameson, a British colonial administrator, had led an illegal incursion into the Boer Republic of the Transvaal. The Jameson raid collapsed into humiliation. The raiders were captured. That embarrassment was compounded by a diplomatic provocation. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a congratulatory telegram to Paul Kruger, the Boer president, praising the Boers for repelling the invaders without outside help. The Kruger telegram was an affront, a direct public rebuke to Britain, and it set London aflame with outrage. Suddenly, the perceived threat from Washington receded in priority. Public anger and strategic concern redirected toward Berlin. The German chancellor's gesture had made it plain that Germany might be willing to back the Boers against Britain, an alarming possibility given the European balance. For Salisbury and his cabinet, the German affront was a gift. It clarified that the European threat was real and required attention. Britain could not countenance antagonizing both Germany and the United States simultaneously. Salisbury seized the opening. He used the German provocation as political cover to disengage from the Venezuelan standoff without surrendering face. Behind closed doors, British diplomats signaled an openness to negotiate. The retreat was framed as prudence rather than weakness. By February 1896, Britain had agreed to the Central American demand: submit the Venezuelan boundary dispute to neutral arbitration. After months of categorical denials, the oft-repeated formula that Her Majesty's government will never submit, Britain blinked. It accepted the American-initiated commission and the premise that the United States could legitimately intervene.
British spokesmen carved out technical conditions to preserve honor. Settlers who had occupied parts of the contested region for 50 years, they insisted, should not be uprooted by an arbitral shift. The United States, keen to claim a diplomatic victory without sparking war, accepted these adjustments. On the surface, the British had gained almost everything they wanted on the ground. In a deeper sense, they had conceded much. The Arbitration Tribunal convened in Paris in 1899 to settle the dispute. The episode that followed was anticlimactic in many ways. The tribunal was dominated by legalists, with 2 British and 2 American jurists, acting in essence as advocates for Venezuela, in consequence of the British refusal to include Venezuelan judges, and a neutral Russian diplomat presiding. When the ruling came, its irony was unmistakable. The tribunal awarded Britain the lion's share of the contested territory, roughly 90%, largely upholding the Schomburg Line and leaving the Urari goldfields under British control. Territorially, Britain had won. Politically and strategically, the United States had claimed precedence. The precise placement of the border mattered far less than the precedent the settlement established. Britain acknowledged that it could not act unilaterally in the Americas without facing American interposition. Washington had established itself as the ultimate arbiter, the de facto guarantor of the Western Hemisphere.
Historians later labeled the resulting strategic reorientation the Great Rapprochement, a conscious British shift toward better relations with the United States. Shocked and chastened, the British ruling elite undertook a rigorous reassessment of global priorities. They surveyed a world where Germany was expanding its military and diplomatic influence, Russia was pressing into Asia, and the United States was surging industrially and demographically. In cold, realpolitik terms, they concluded that the American giant could not be defeated and therefore should be befriended. This decision was not born of sentiment or cultural kinship, but of hard calculation. American industrial might was becoming central to global economic dynamics, and securing Washington's goodwill was an insurance policy for Britain's continued survival elsewhere. The rapprochement produced concrete shifts. Over the following years, Britain began to cede strategic leverage in the Western Hemisphere. The most consequential concession concerned the Panama Canal. For half a century, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had bound Britain and the United States to jointly manage any Isthmian canal, precisely to prevent either party from monopolizing the critical trade route. But in 1901, the United States demanded the exclusive right to construct and control the canal. Where earlier Britain would likely have resisted, for denying control of global choke points would have cut to the core of British maritime dominance, now it relented. The negotiation produced the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, commonly called in U.S. sources the Hay-Pauncefote or Hay-Pouncey Vote. British nomenclature varied, which allowed the United States to proceed unilaterally. Britain received no territorial compensation, no financial payment, merely an implicit understanding that the Caribbean had become America's strategic backyard.
Military posture also changed. For 2 centuries, Britain's North America and West Indies Squadron, based in Bermuda, Halifax, and Jamaica, had symbolized Royal Navy vigilance in the hemisphere. In the early 20th century, First Sea Lord Admiral John Jackie Fisher made a transformative decision. He recalled the squadron, stripped away obsolete gunboats, and reconstituted naval priorities to face the rising continental naval threat in the North Sea posed by Germany. Britain pulled back its forward presence in the Caribbean, drew down garrisons, and effectively demilitarized the frontier with the United States. The assumption now, explicit or not, was that America would assume policing duties in its hemisphere. Britain would not need to defend Canada or Caribbean possessions from the United States so long as Anglo-American relations held. That assumption was put to the test soon. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, ousting Spanish rule from Cuba and seizing Puerto Rico, an unmistakable opening of American imperial ambition overseas. Britain, rather than opposing, was the lone European power to tacitly encourage the American action. While France and Germany sympathized with Spain, London quietly cheered the American victory, and British diplomats worked to dissuade other European nations from intervening. The alliance of convenience deepened. The relationship hardened further during the Venezuela debt crisis of 1902. President Cipriano Castro of Venezuela defaulted on European loans. Britain, Germany, and Italy dispatched naval squadrons to blockade Venezuelan ports, briefly seizing forts and gunboats to coerce payment. Theodore Roosevelt watched apprehensively. He had no love for European gunboat diplomacy in the hemisphere. He feared that these interventions might be a prelude to territorial grabs. Roosevelt responded with his own twist on the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary. In essence, he proposed that the United States would serve as an international policeman in the Western Hemisphere, intervening where Latin American instability might invite European intervention. The Americans quietly warned the Germans and the British to stand down. The British reaction was telling. Rather than contesting Roosevelt's claims, they withdrew their ships and deferred. Arthur Balfour, then Prime Minister, made public remarks endorsing a larger American role. Britain should welcome increased influence for the United States in the hemisphere, he said, for it protected wider British interests. The reversal was stark.
Within a few years, Britain had gone from the brink of war with the United States over a jungle boundary to encouraging Washington to assume hegemonic responsibility for Latin America. The consequences of that pivot rippled across the 20th century. By choosing negotiation and partnership in 1895 rather than confrontation, Britain secured an ally that proved decisive when catastrophe struck in 1914. The outbreak of World War I in Europe exhausted British financial and industrial resources within a couple of years. It was American loans, supplies, and eventual military involvement that kept Britain in the fight. Had Anglo-American relations remained hostile after 1895, the United States might have remained neutral indefinitely, or worse, tilted toward Germany. Instead, the political realignment born in the Venezuelan crisis laid the groundwork for the Anglo-American cooperation that would prove decisive in the Great War.
But that cooperation came at a cost. Britain did not simply trade influence in the Americas for friendship. It surrendered the hegemonic posture that had defined its 19th century identity. The Venezuela crisis represented the moment the imperial torch began to be passed. Britain peered at the United States and recognized a state with more steel, more coal, larger population reserves, and an ever-growing treasure of capital and production, a nation whose economic engine increasingly determined the course of world affairs. Reason, not romance, guided British policy. The empire would step aside where necessary to preserve its core and its continued existence. Psychologically, the impact on Britain's governing class was profound. The imperial elite began to recast themselves not as triumphant sovereigns of world order, but as elder custodians, the Greeks to America's Romans, a cultivated, historically rich culture advising the brash newcomer. That framing made acceptance of decline more palatable. For Venezuela, the outcome was ambivalent. British expansion into their territory was averted, but U.S. hegemony in practice replaced European threats. Venezuela would fall under substantial American influence, economically and politically, particularly as U.S. interests grew in the region's oil resources. The Monroe Doctrine, it became clear, had not been a shield designed to protect Latin America from foreign domination, but a mechanism for ensuring that the only acceptable form of imperialism in the hemisphere would be American. If you visit today the forested boundary between Guyana and Venezuela, you'll see a landscape reclaimed by jungle, old mining camps swallowed by vines, rusted machinery disappearing under moss. Yet the invisible line slicing through those trees remains a historical fault line. That strip of jungle marks the hinge between centuries, where 19th century empires confronted 20th century states. It is the place where, in effect, the British lion recoiled and the American eagle discovered the voice and authority to issue orders that others heeded. The Venezuela crisis of the 1890s is, in many respects, an overlooked prelude to the modern international order. It demonstrates that sometimes the most consequential battles are those that never erupt into cannon fire. Britain surrendered the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot, and in doing so secured a lifeline that preserved the nation from later annihilation. The concession was humiliating in imperial terms, but it was arguably the shrewdest of diplomatic maneuvers, a sober calculation to trade immediate prerogatives for long-term survival. In the harsh arithmetic of empires, survival may well be the only meaningful victory. I'm Leo, and this is the Documentary History Hub channel. Subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because when history is finally written, you'll want to be among the minority who saw it coming.